I make my living making sure people can trust their locks. On the night of my own housewarming party, in front of nearly everyone I love, my landlord had every single one of mine changed, and then told the room I was the dangerous one, the tenant who wouldn't leave. The reason he'd had to do it in front of my own guests. What he didn't know was that I'd built the system standing between us that night, and that it remembers everything that happens to it, permanently, whether he intended for it to or not. My name is Frankie Doran. I've spent 12 years as a locksmith and security installer, and this is the story of the one lock I never thought I'd need to prove was mine. My father taught me the trade, and he had exactly one rule he repeated so often it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like scripture. Locks don't lie. People do. He meant it literally at first. A lock either turns or it doesn't. A key either fits or it doesn't. And no amount of talking changes either fact. I didn't understand until years into the business that he meant something bigger by it too. That the physical record of who came and went somewhere is one of the few honest things left in most disputes, if you're careful enough to keep it. I run a small operation now, Doran Security and Locksmith, mostly residential and small commercial jobs, rekeys, smart lock installs, the occasional break-in consult where I get to explain to a shaken homeowner exactly how someone got in and exactly what would have stopped them. I'm good at it. Good enough that property managers across 3 counties call me first. And good enough that when a tenant dispute goes sideways over who let whom into where, my access logs have settled more arguments than any conversation ever could. I like that about the job. A lock doesn't have an opinion about who it likes better. 8 months before my housewarming party, I signed a lease on a row house unit that needed real work, original hardware from the 70s, wiring that predated smoke detectors having batteries you didn't have to remember to change. My landlord, a property investor named Desmond Kane, who owned the building along with 3 others across the city, offered me a deal I'd have been foolish to say no to. I'd install a full smart lock and camera access system across the building. Every unit, the front entry, the shared basement. At cost, in exchange for a reduced rate on my own rent for the length of the contract. It made sense on paper. I got a showcase installation I could point future clients to. He got a modern security system without paying full market rate for the labor. I set it up myself over 3 long weekends, unit by unit, and I kept the administrative credentials the way I keep every system I build, under my own login, separate from the property management account, because that's simply how you're supposed to build these things. A vendor keeps their own keys to their own work until a formal handoff says otherwise. Nobody had asked me to hand mine off yet. I want to tell you about the last dispute my logs settled before all of this started, because it's the reason I trusted the system as much as I did going into that October. A tenant in one of Kane's other buildings accused the night doorman of letting a stranger into the lobby who later stole a package from the mailroom. The doorman swore he hadn't buzzed anyone in. Kane was ready to fire him on the spot to make the tenant happy. I pulled the entry logs at his request. Every badge scan, every buzz-in, time-stamped to the second, and showed him the actual sequence. A resident on the 3rd floor had propped the door with a folded takeout menu for 6 minutes while carrying groceries up in 2 trips. The doorman kept his job. I remember Kane thanking me for it at the time, genuinely, the way you thank someone for saving you from a mistake you were about to make in a hurry. I filed that away as evidence he respected what the system actually did. I had no idea, a year later, how much that same respect would evaporate the moment the logs pointed at him instead of someone else. The friction with Kane started small enough that for months I didn't think of it as friction at all. A maintenance request for a leaking radiator that took 6 weeks instead of the usual 2 or 3 days. A comment at a building meeting, offhand, about how some tenants forget this is a business, not a charity. Nothing I could have pointed to and called unreasonable on its own, I'd been a tenant long enough, and a small business owner long enough, to know that landlords have bad months, same as everyone else. Then, in August, my neighbour Delia, retired, sharp, the kind of person who notices everything on our block because she's been sitting on her stoop watching it for 30 years, mentioned in passing that a real estate agent had spent 20 minutes outside our building with a tape measure and a clipboard the week before. Didn't go in, as far as I saw, she said. Just walked the front of the lot twice, took some photos, left. I asked Kane about it directly the next time I saw him, mostly out of curiosity. He waved it off. Insurance reassessment. Nothing exciting, he said. You know how those companies are, always double-checking something. I believed him. I had no particular reason not to. In September, at our lease renewal, he mentioned, almost as an aside, folded into a sentence about rising property taxes, that he'd eventually want the flexibility to bring some units back to market rate, and that he hoped, when the time came, I'd understand it wasn't personal. I told him I appreciated the heads up and asked when that time might be. He said he honestly didn't know yet. I wrote the date of that conversation down in the small notebook I keep for my business. An old habit, the same one my father drilled into me. The one where you write down anything a client says that might matter later, the same day you hear it, before your memory has a chance to round the edges off. I didn't think I was building a case. I thought I was being a careful tenant the same way I'm a careful locksmith. Those turned out to be the same instinct. 2 weeks before my party, I did something that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with it in hindsight. My accountant needed a full export of my installation and maintenance logs across all my active contracts for my annual business filing, a routine, boring administrative task I do every October without fail. I pulled a complete export of every system I managed, Kane's building included, and saved it to my own secured server the way I always do, purely so my bookkeeper could reconcile billable service hours against contract dates. I didn't look closely at any of it beyond the hours column. I had no idea, sealing that file and moving on to the next line item, that I had just quietly made myself a witness to everything that was about to happen. A witness who'd started keeping notes before there was anything yet to prove. One more thing happened in that same stretch that I didn't understand until much later. A week before the party, Kane's assistant, a soft-spoken young man named Corbin who handled scheduling for maintenance visits, texted me directly to ask, almost in passing, whether I'd be home the following Saturday evening, just for planning purposes. I told him yes, mentioned it was actually for a party I was hosting, and thought nothing more of it. It would be months before I understood that he'd been the one tasked with confirming, quietly, that I'd have a full house of witnesses that exact night. That the timing hadn't been a coincidence Kane stumbled into, but a detail somebody had gone out of their way to confirm in advance. The party was supposed to be a small, ordinary kind of happy. 8 months in the unit, the last of the renovation work finally done. New floors in the kitchen, a wall I'd knocked down myself to open up the living room, the smart lock panel by the front door glowing a soft, steady green that I'd installed with my own hands the same weekend I moved my furniture in. I invited close to 30 people. My crew from the shop, a handful of clients who'd become real friends over the years, my neighbour Delia, my mother, and Gus Alvarez, who trained me in this trade after my father died when I was 23, and who I still call for advice on hard jobs more often than I'd like to admit out loud. And Theo. Theo Ibarra and I had been together 4 months by then. A building inspector I'd met on a job site, quiet and steady, in a way that took me a while to trust after a string of men who mistook my confidence for something they needed to compete with. That party was the first time most of my friends were meeting him at all. And I remember standing in my own kitchen an hour before anyone arrived, genuinely nervous in a way I hadn't been in years, wanting the people I loved most to see the life I'd actually built for myself. Gus arrived early, the way he always does, and stood in my newly opened living room, turning slowly in a full circle, taking in the floors, the exposed brick I'd uncovered behind the drywall, the lock panel by the door. "You did good work here, Frankie," he said, and then, because he can't help himself around any install of mine, he tapped the panel twice with one knuckle. "Locks don't lie," he said, half to himself, the same way he's said it to me 100 times since I was 23 years old and grieving my father in his shop, learning the trade from a man who'd decided, without ever quite saying so, to make sure I didn't have to grieve alone. People do, but not these. These just tell you what actually happened. I laughed and told him I was going to put that on a business card eventually. I had no idea how soon I'd need it to be true. By 8 o'clock, the apartment was full. My crew laughing too loud by the kitchen island, Delia holding court with my mother about the neighborhood's better and worse decades, Theo's hand resting easy on the small of my back while I introduced him to my oldest friend from trade school. It was, for about 90 minutes, exactly the evening I'd hoped it would be. The knock came at 8:40, hard enough that conversation actually paused before anyone answered it. I opened the door myself, still holding a half-empty glass, and found Desmond Kane standing on my own front step with two men I didn't recognize behind him, one holding a toolbox, the other holding a folder thick enough that it had its own weight in the doorway light. "Frankie?" Kane said, and his voice had a practiced evenness to it that I'd later understand was the most deliberate thing about the entire evening. "I'm sorry to interrupt. This won't take long. I want to walk through exactly what happened over the next several minutes, because I've replayed them more times than almost anything else in my life, and because the shape of what he did only makes sense once you see all of it laid end to end." He stepped past me into my own doorway without being invited, which stopped every conversation in the apartment behind me at once. The man with the toolbox went straight to my smart lock panel, the one I'd installed myself, the one Gus had tapped an hour earlier, and started removing the faceplate with the specific unhurried confidence of someone who'd been told exactly what to do and exactly when to do it. "What is this?" I said. And I kept my voice level, because 12 years of walking into other people's worst moments has taught me that the person who raises their voice first usually loses the room. Kane turned to face not me, but the room behind me. 30 of my closest people, frozen mid-conversation, Theo's hand gone still against my back. "I want to apologize to all of you for the timing," he said, pitched for the whole apartment, the way you pitch something you've rehearsed. "I didn't want to do this in front of guests, but I've been left with no choice. Frankie has refused to vacate this unit despite repeated formal notice, and given some recent concerns about her conduct toward my staff, I've been advised to secure the property tonight rather than wait." The room didn't just go quiet. It went the specific kind of quiet where you can hear someone's ice shifting in their glass 3 feet away. "I have never received a formal notice," I said. "There is no eviction filing. You know that, because you haven't filed one." "There's a process for this," Kane said, calm, almost kind, in a voice built for exactly this audience. "I understand it's upsetting to hear in front of your friends, but I have a responsibility to the other tenants in this building, and to my own safety, frankly, given how this conversation has gone in the past." He glanced deliberately at the folder his second man was holding. "I have documentation of concerning behavior. I'd rather not go through it here, in front of everyone, out of respect for you. But I will if I have to." There was no documentation of concerning behavior. There had never been an incident between us that rose above a tense conversation about a radiator, but he said it with the specific weight of a man reading off a clipboard, and I watched 30 faces behind me, people who loved me, people who'd known me for years, do the small, involuntary math that happens whenever someone hears an accusation delivered with total confidence in a room where they don't yet have the full story. I watched my mother's hand go to her mouth. I watched my oldest trade school friend look at me with something that wasn't quite doubt yet, but was standing right next to it. Kane wasn't finished. He nodded to his second man, who opened the thick folder and handed him a single printed page. "I didn't want to have to do this," Kane said, and read aloud, to the room, a fabricated account of a supposed incident 3 weeks earlier, a claim that I had confronted building staff in a threatening manner over a maintenance dispute, an event that had never happened, involving a staff member I couldn't even place a name to. He read it slowly, in the same practiced, regretful voice, pausing after certain phrases the way you pause when you want a sentence to land rather than simply be heard. I watched a co-worker of mine, a woman named Priscilla Nunes, who'd worked beside me for 6 years and referred me half her own clients, go very still, her wineglass forgotten in her hand, her expression sliding from confusion towards something closer to caution. She would call 2 days later, apologetic, to say she needed to step back a bit from referring clients my way until things settled. I understood, watching that page get read aloud in my own living room, that whatever Kane was actually trying to accomplish that night, ruining my reputation in front of exactly the people who could spread it fastest, was not a side effect. It was the plan. The man with the toolbox finished pulling the panel and held up the physical override key Kane had apparently supplied him, and in under 2 minutes, my own front door, the one I'd installed with my own hands 8 months earlier, had a rekeyed physical cylinder in it that answered to a key I didn't have. "Effective tonight," Kane said to the room. "Ms. Doran will need to vacate. I've arranged for her belongings to be secured and available for retrieval through the proper channel. I'm sorry it happened this way. I truly am." He said, "I'm sorry it happened this way," like a man delivering sympathetic bad news instead of a man who had just staged it. "I want to tell you what the next 20 minutes actually felt like, because I think it's the part of this story people skip past too fast when they hear how it ends." I did not feel calm. I did not feel like a woman with a plan. I felt exactly like what I was. A professional humiliated in the one place she'd built to feel safest, in front of every person whose good opinion she'd spent years earning. My mother started crying, quietly, the kind of crying that's trying very hard not to make things worse. Delia stood up from the couch, sharp as ever, and said loudly, "This is not how any of this is supposed to work, and everyone in this room knows it." But Kane's second man, heavier set, standing near the door with his arms crossed in the specific way that's meant to suggest authority without saying anything at all, simply said, "Ma'am, I'd ask you to stay out of it." And Delia, 71 years old and afraid of exactly nothing in her life, sat back down anyway, because the room had gone strange in a way that made even the boldest people in it smaller. Gus tried. I'll give him that, and I've told him since that I'll always give him that. He stepped forward, planted himself directly in front of Kane, and said, "Desmond, you know me. You know this woman's work better than almost anyone in this city. Whatever's going on here, this is not the way to handle it, and you know that." Kane looked at him with something almost like regret. "Gus, I respect you," he said, "but this isn't a conversation for tonight. I'd hate for this to become something it doesn't need to be." It was said gently. It was still unmistakably a threat, and Gus, 68 years old, a guest in someone else's confrontation, understood it as one and stepped back. And Theo, who I'd been so nervous for my friends to meet an hour earlier, stood absolutely still the entire time, his hand no longer on my back at all, saying nothing, not defending me, not challenging Kane, just watching, the way you watch something happening to someone else, even though it was happening 8 inches from him to someone he'd been dating for 4 months. I noticed that. I noticed it in real time, in the middle of the worst 10 minutes of my adult life, and some small, cold part of me filed it away the same way I file away everything else that might matter later. Guests started leaving within minutes. Not dramatically, just quietly gathering coats, murmuring apologies to me that had nowhere to land, unsure whether staying made them witnesses or intruders. By 9:15, my housewarming party had emptied into the street, and I stood in the hallway outside my own rekeyed front door, holding a coat someone had handed me on their way out, watching Kane's 2 men load a folding table's worth of tools back into a van like they'd just finished an ordinary job. Kane found me in the hallway before he left. "I truly am sorry it came to this in front of your friends," he said. "I hope, once things settle, you'll understand I didn't have another option." I didn't say anything back. I didn't trust my own voice yet to come out steady, and 12 years in this trade has taught me that the moment you don't trust your own voice is exactly the moment to stop talking and start writing things down instead. If you've ever had someone humiliate you in front of the people whose opinion matters most, and then thank themselves for how gently they did it, stay with me, because the next stretch of this story is where I stopped being the person that happened to and started being the person who proved exactly what it was. I slept at my mother's that night, on a couch I hadn't slept on since I was 22, and I did not sleep much. What I did instead, somewhere around 2 in the morning, was open my laptop and pull up the administrative dashboard for the exact system that had just been used against me. I want to be honest about something that isn't flattering. My first instinct was to log in and pull everything myself immediately, that same night, and lay it all out for anyone who'd listen. I didn't do that. And I'm glad I didn't, because I've spent 12 years watching other people's evidence get thrown out of disputes for exactly that kind of hurried self-collection. Evidence you gather in a rage at 2 in the morning from your own login about your own case is evidence a good attorney can spend an entire afternoon picking apart before anyone even looks at what it says. I closed the laptop. I called a tenant's rights attorney the next morning instead, a sharp, unhurried woman named Adalis Fenn, and I told her everything, in order, the way I'd tell a client exactly what happened to their front door and in what sequence. "The first thing I need you to understand," she told me in our first meeting, "is that what he did last night, physically rekeying your unit and denying you access without a court order, is what's called a self-help eviction, and it's illegal in this state regardless of what he believes about your lease or your behavior. That's true, even if you were the worst tenant in the city. Landlords do not get to skip the court and go straight to the locks." She paused. "The second thing I need you to understand is that being right about that isn't the same as this being simple. He's going to have a story. We need yours to be undeniable, not just true." I told her about the system, about installing it myself, about the administrative credentials still sitting under my own vendor login, separate from Kane's property management account, exactly the way they're supposed to be until a formal handoff happens. Odalis sat forward. "Does that system log administrative changes? Who accessed what? And when?" "Every single one," I said. "Every lock change, every access attempt, every permission edit. It's tamper evident by design. That's the whole selling point of the platform I use. It doesn't just log what happened. It certifies through the manufacturer's own servers that the log wasn't altered afterward." "Then we're not going to pull it ourselves," she said. "We're going to request it the right way, through the manufacturer, with a formal legal request, so nobody can ever say later that you shaped what it shows." The weeks after that were slower and harder than I expected, and I think that's the part of this story that matters most, because none of it resolved itself the way I wanted it to just because I had a plan. Kane, it turned out, had already been busy. 3 days after the party, I received formal notice, through an actual filing this time, ironically enough, that he was pursuing an unlawful detainer action against me, claiming I'd violated my lease through conduct posing a safety concern to staff and other tenants, the exact vague language he'd used in my own doorway in front of 30 witnesses. He'd gotten to the courthouse first. I remember sitting in Odalis's office reading that filing and feeling something close to disbelief. That a man who had, days earlier, physically locked me out of my own home without any legal process at all, was now the one accusing me, in writing, of being the danger. "This is actually good for us," Odalis told me, and I remember not believing her at first. He's put his story in writing now, with a timeline, before he's seen a single thing we have. That's a story he can't quietly revise later. Word had already started moving through my professional circles, the way word does. A property management company I'd worked with for years called to pause an ongoing contract, citing, carefully, some things we've heard about a tenant situation, without naming Kane directly. I lost that contract entirely within the month. Priscilla Nunes, the co-worker who'd gone quiet at the party while Kane read his fabricated complaint aloud, called 2 days later, exactly as I'd expected, asking to step back a bit from referring clients until things settled. I want to be honest that it hurt more than I expected, coming from someone I'd trained side by side with for 6 years. Not because I blamed her for being cautious, but because I understood, hearing her careful, apologetic voice, that a single, confidently delivered lie in my own living room had done in one evening what 12 years of careful work hadn't been able to fully protect against. My crew noticed clients getting quieter on the phone with me too, a specific kind of politeness that meant they'd heard something and didn't want to ask. I want to be honest that this part nearly broke something in me that the party itself hadn't quite managed to. Being humiliated in my own home in front of my friends was devastating. Watching my professional reputation, the thing I'd built with my own hands over 12 years, one careful job at a time, start to quietly erode over a story that wasn't even true, was a different, slower kind of damage. And some nights, I genuinely wondered whether fighting this at all was worth what it was costing me in the meantime. Odalis filed the formal record request with the smart lock manufacturer 3 weeks after the party. The company's legal department, I learned, takes these requests seriously, precisely because their entire business depends on their logs being trusted in exactly this kind of dispute. But taking it seriously meant a review process, a certification process, and a turnaround measured in weeks, not days. The first partial export we got back, 5 weeks after the party, was frustratingly incomplete. It confirmed the physical Reiki event and its timestamp, which we already knew. But the deeper administrative trail, the part that would show who had created new access credentials and when, required a second, more specific request that Odalis hadn't realized we'd need until she saw what the first export was missing. I remember the specific low feeling of that week, of having done everything right, and still not yet having the one piece that would actually matter. It was Delia, of all people, who gave me the detail that told me exactly what to ask for next. She called me on a Tuesday, apologetic for bothering me, to mention that the real estate agent with the clipboard had been back, twice more in September and again in early October, always with the same careful, unhurried walk around the building's exterior, always leaving without going inside. "I only mention it," she said, "because the second time he wasn't alone. There was a younger man with him in a suit, the kind of suit that looks expensive from across the street. They stood by the front steps a long while, looking at the door. Your door, actually, near as I could tell. I gave that detail to Odalis the next day. She filed an amended request specifically asking the manufacturer for any new administrative accounts created on the building's access system in the 8 weeks before the party, not just the night of Reiki event, but everything leading up to it. The second export arrived 11 days before our hearing date, and it's the reason I stopped worrying, for the first time in 2 months, about how this was actually going to end. It showed that 4 weeks before my housewarming party, 3 full weeks before Kane had said a single word to me about eventually needing the unit back, a new administrative account had been created on the building's access system. Not under the property management login, a separate one, created from a personal device with permissions scoped narrowly to exactly one unit in the building. Mine. I sat with that for a long time before I called Odalis, because I understood immediately what it meant, and I needed a minute before I said it out loud to someone else. He hadn't decided, in a moment of panic at my party, that he needed to lock me out. He'd built the ability to do it a month in advance, quietly, before he'd ever mentioned a timeline to me at all. Whatever story he was planning to tell a judge about a spontaneous safety concern, the system itself remembered that the door to my whole story had been opened weeks before he ever knocked on it. The hearing was held in a modest civil courtroom that smelled like every courtroom does, faintly of old carpet and coffee nobody had refilled in hours. Kane arrived with an attorney and, to my genuine surprise, with the man who'd installed the physical Reiki the night of my party, a locksmith named Robert Isaac, hired specifically, it would turn out, to give sworn testimony. Kane's attorney opened plainly, confidently. The way lawyers open when they believe the story they're about to tell is the only one in the room. Your Honor, this case is being presented as a straightforward illegal lockout. It is not. Mr. Kane responded, in the moment, to a credible and escalating safety concern involving a tenant who had, on multiple documented occasions, behaved in a manner staff found threatening. He acted to protect his other tenants and his staff. We'll show that this was a reasonable response to an emergency, not a premeditated act. He called Kane's brother, Aldo, first, a heavy-set, careful man who I recognized immediately as the second figure who'd stood at my own front door the night of the party, arms crossed, telling Delia to sit back down. Aldo testified that he'd witnessed escalating tension between me and building staff over the preceding months, and that he'd personally recommended his brother take protective action for the safety of other tenants. He was polished, unhurried, clearly rehearsed, and for several minutes I watched Judge Onwuka's expression give away nothing at all, which frightened me more than open skepticism would have. Odalis's cross-examination was short. Mr. Kane, what is your relationship to the properties involved in this case? I co-signed on the mortgages for 2 of them, alongside my brother. So you have a direct financial interest in this property being sold free of any tenant disputes? Yes, I suppose I do. And the escalating tension you described, did you witness any of it personally, or was it relayed to you by your brother? A pause. Relayed to me, by Desmond. Odalis let that answer sit in the room for a moment before moving on, and I watched something in Judge Onwuka's careful neutrality shift, almost imperceptibly, towards something closer to attention. He called Robert Isaac next, the locksmith hired for the physical Reiki. Isaac testified, evenly, that he'd been contacted by Kane the afternoon of the party and asked to perform an emergency Reiki due to tenant safety concerns, and that in his professional opinion, the request had seemed urgent and legitimate at the time. It was, I'll admit, a reasonably credible few minutes of testimony on its own. Then Odalis stood and asked Isaac a single, narrow question. Mr. Isaac, when did Mr. Kane first contact you about this job? The afternoon of the party, like I said. Not before that? No earlier conversation, no earlier arrangement? No, ma'am. Same day. It was presented to me as urgent. Odalis let that sit for exactly a beat before she moved to the exhibit that would matter more than anything else in the room that day. The certified export went up on the courtroom's small projector screen, formatted plainly, time-stamped, authenticated by the manufacturer's own legal affidavit, confirming it hadn't been altered by any party involved in the dispute. Not by me, not by Kane, not by anyone. Odalis walked the judge through it the way you'd walk anyone through an unfamiliar system, patiently, without drama, letting the dates do the talking. Your Honour, this shows the creation of a new administrative account, scoped specifically to Ms. Doran's unit 4 weeks prior to the incident in question. 3 full weeks before Mr. Kane ever raised the subject of vacating the unit with Ms. Doran directly, by his own admission in his written filing. She let that land. This was not an emergency response to a spontaneous safety concern. This was infrastructure, built quietly, in advance, for exactly the purpose it was eventually used for. I watched Kane's face while that timestamp sat on the screen behind him, and I recognized something in it I'd seen before in 12 years of standing in front of people confronted with a lock they didn't expect to answer honestly. The specific stillness of someone doing fast, silent arithmetic on how much of their story just stopped being defensible. His attorney tried to recover. Your Honour, the existence of an account doesn't establish intent to deceive. Mr. Kane may simply have been preparing responsibly for a contingency. Judge Onwuka looked up from the exhibit for the first time. Counsel, your client's own filing describes a spontaneous safety concern that arose the night of the incident. This exhibit shows deliberate technical preparation a month in advance, kept from the tenant, kept, as far as I can tell, from your own witness, who just testified under oath that he believed this was a same-day emergency. I'd like to hear from Mr. Kane directly. Kane took the stand, and for the first several minutes he held to the same careful, sympathetic register he'd used in my own doorway. A man who'd made a hard call to protect people, who regretted the timing, who'd never intended cruelty. It was Odalis's next question that finally cracked it. Mr. Kane, why did you create administrative access to Ms. Doran's specific unit a month before the incident, using a personal device, separate from your standard property management account? He was quiet for long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of testimony. When he finally answered, his voice had lost the practiced warmth entirely. I was under contract to sell that building, he said. All 4 of my properties, actually, as part of one package deal. The buyer required vacant possession of 2 specific units before closing, including hers, and the closing date was fixed. He stopped, started again. I was 6 weeks from losing everything if that sale fell through. My brother had co-signed on 2 of those mortgages. It wasn't just my name on the loans anymore. His voice actually shook. I told myself if I just got her out cleanly, quickly, before the closing, none of it would matter how it happened. I told myself the ends would be worth it. I set up the access weeks ahead because I didn't think I'd have the nerve to do it in the moment if I hadn't already made it easy for myself in advance. I'm not proud of that. But I want the record to show it wasn't cruelty. It was panic, planned out in advance so I wouldn't have to feel it happening. I understood, sitting there. Something that surprised me. That his fear was probably real, and that being real didn't excuse a single thing he'd done. You didn't just cost me a night, I said, when it was my turn to speak, and Judge Onwuka nodded for me to continue. You used my own front door, the one I installed with my own hands, to make 30 people who love me believe, even for an hour, that I might be dangerous. You did that to buy yourself time. My locks didn't lie about any of it. You did. For a month, in advance, on purpose. Judge Onwuka's ruling came down clearly and without much delay. She found that Kane had committed an unlawful self-help eviction, entitling me to statutory damages under the state's Tenant Protection Code. In this jurisdiction, a multiple of my monthly rent for every day I was denied access, which by the time of the hearing had accumulated into a sum substantial enough that Kane's attorney visibly flinched, reading it off the judgment. She dismissed his unlawful detainer filing against me outright, noting, in language I'll remember for a long time, that a landlord cannot manufacture a tenant's supposed danger to excuse conduct he had already engineered the means to commit weeks in advance. What neither of us fully understood yet, sitting in that courtroom, was how much further the consequences would travel. The sale of Kane's 4-property package collapsed within 6 weeks. The buyer's attorneys, reviewing the now public court filing during their own due diligence, invoked a contingency clause tied to pending litigation and walked away from the deal entirely. The very outcome Kane had risked everything, including his own dignity and mine, to protect never happened anyway. He'd sacrificed a month of quiet planning and a public humiliation of someone who trusted him to save a sale that the humiliation itself ended up destroying. I want to tell you what happened after, because I think it matters as much as the hearing itself. Kane's remaining properties went into a slow, well-documented decline over the following year. A second tenant, emboldened by the public record of my case, filed a similar complaint over a delayed maintenance issue that had quietly worsened into a habitability violation, and the local tenant advocacy group started using my case, with my permission, as a teaching example in their Know Your Rights materials. I don't know what ultimately became of his other mortgages. I know his brother stopped being listed as a co-signer on anything filed publicly after that year, which tells its own story without needing me to fill in the rest. Theo and I didn't survive the winter. I want to be honest about that, because I think the tidy version of this story would have him showing up at my door with flowers and an apology dramatic enough to earn back the 4 months we'd had. That's not what happened. He apologized, genuinely, I think, a few weeks after the party. Told me he'd frozen because he didn't know the rules of a fight that wasn't his to have, that he'd never seen anything like it and hadn't trusted himself to say the right thing in the moment. I told him I understood exactly what that kind of freezing feels like from the outside, and that understanding it didn't change what it had cost me to stand there alone in front of everyone, waiting for him to move and watching him not. We tried for a few more months after that. It didn't take. Some things, once you've seen them clearly in a doorway at 8:40 on a Tuesday, don't quite go back to how they looked before. Gus still comes by the shop most Fridays. He brought a bottle of something decent the week the judgment came down, set it on my workbench without ceremony, and said, "Told you. Locks don't lie." I told him he'd been saying that to me since I was 23 years old, and it had taken this long for me to actually need it in a courtroom instead of a workshop. He said that was rather the point of teaching someone something early. You don't get to pick which day they'll finally need it. Priscilla called again the week the judgment was made public, quieter than the first time. "I should have said something in that room instead of just going quiet," she told me. "I've thought about that a lot since. I'm sorry it took a court ruling for me to trust what I already half knew that night." She's sending clients my way again, more than before, actually. I think in part out of something between guilt and genuine respect. And I've decided I don't need to sort out exactly which for the friendship to still be worth having. My mother still brings up that couch at her place sometimes, half joking, asking if I remember how to sleep on it. Delia got a new lock on her own door out of the whole affair, insisted on paying full price, which I refused, and we settled on her bringing me a casserole every time she catches wind of gossip on the block worth knowing, which turns out to be a fair trade for a locksmith who wants to stay ahead of her own neighborhood. I reinstalled my own front door panel myself, the week after the ruling, on a quiet Sunday with no guests and no audience. New hardware, same green light, same quiet hum when it recognizes the right key. I stood in my own doorway a long time afterward, the way you do after finishing a job that mattered more than the ones before it. And I thought about my father And about Gus tapping that panel with one knuckle an hour before everything happened, saying the same 4 words he'd been saying to me my whole career. Locks don't lie. People do. I understood it for years as a simple fact about hardware. I understand it now as something closer to a promise. That if you build the honest version of a thing carefully enough, and you keep good records the same way, every single time, without exception, it will still be telling the truth long after everyone standing in the room that night has moved on to their own version of what happened. Mine did. I just had to be patient enough to let it. If someone has ever used their own authority to make you look like the dangerous one, instead of admitting what they'd actually done, I'd like to hear how you found your way through it. Tell me in the comments. And if these stories matter to you, stay close. There's always another door worth understanding.